Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Katrina Lacerna, and I'm the Asian Pacific Resource Center librarian for LA County Library. I'm honored and excited to be your host for tonight's event, Author Talk with Art Nomura. This is one of our special events during Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Happy Heritage Month, y'all. We here at LA County Library would like to invite you to celebrate with us this May. Our moderator, Kasha, will kindly share a link to our special Heritage Month page, which along with information on events at your local library, that page also contains Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander resources such as book lists, videos, and activity pages for all ages. So please do give that page a visit. Tonight, if you have any questions for Art or myself, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end of the program. For general questions and tech issues, please put them in the chat, and our moderator, Kasha, or myself will be able to assist you. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be available on the LA County YouTube page for you to enjoy and share with others at a later time. Now, before we do go further, I did want to share a land acknowledgement with you, which is what we do for all of our events here at LA County Library. Let me go ahead and bring that up and read that off to you. Okay. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Tataviam, Serrano, Kitch, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continue their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including, in no particular order, the Fernandino Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians, Kitch Nation, San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, San Fernandino Band of Mission Indians. Thank you. Now I will have the pleasure of introducing you to tonight's guest, Art Nomura. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Art before we do begin with his program. Born and raised in Manzanar concentration camp, raised in South LA, East LA, and Orange County, author Art Nomura currently resides in Culver City, which is where he is joining us from today. Art Nomura has worked as a painter, sculptor, potter, filmmaker, writer, and new media artist since 1968. Several of his works have themes directly connected to the Asian American experience. His work has screened on PBS, cable, and in festivals, galleries, museums, and universities worldwide. Nomura has taught media production and writing since 1981. He is Professor Emeritus in Film TV Production at the School of Film and Television, Loyola Marymount University, and continues to teach select courses at LMU between writing, gardening, traveling, bicycling, Qigong, Pilates, social activism, design construction, and art making activities. He's a graduate of Garfield High School, Los Angeles, California State University, Los Angeles with a BA in representational arts, and UCLA with a MFA in theater arts. He is a Vietnam era veteran, husband, father of 3, grandfather to 3, brother to 3, and first cousin to 28. Tonight, Art will discuss his latest book, Mizuko, True Spirit. Here's a brief summary of the novel. When the Takahashi family, one of the wealthiest in Western Japan, loses their great fortune in 1900, 5-year-old Mizuko Takahashi goes from riches to rags. Mizuko's lifetime in Japan and America offers the reader an intimate look into the world of an immigrant. It is a story of one woman's efforts to surmount racism, sexism, and poverty in the 20th century. Welcome, Art. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. And I do believe we're going to start off the evening with a presentation that you have to share with us. Let me get those slides ready for you, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to our special guest for the evening, Art.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for attending. And I want to present Mizuko True Spirit. I have a few photos that you will see if you buy the book or if you borrow the book. But I thought I would show them to you and explain them to you as well. So we can go to the next slide. This is Mizuko, my paternal grandmother. And this was taken in 1918. She was 22 years old. It was taken for passport purposes. You can see my father, Henry Takuma Nomura, standing next to her, and my uncle, Jiro Nomura, seated on her lap. This is a very rare photo because she always felt like she was mitomonai. That means that she was not worthy of being seen in public. And so this is one of only 6 photos of her that existed before she was incarcerated at Manzanar. Next slide. This is the Takahashi Kumon. She wasn't always in Nomura. When she was born to the Takahashi family, which was a very prosperous family in Western Japan, near Hiroshima, is where her family was when she grew up. But the roots went back 300 years to Kyoto. I was lucky enough to get a family tree that existed for the Takahashis. And of course, they had a kamon or mon of their own, much like the emblems that you would see in European history documents. This is very popular in Japan, and some of the select families in Japan were able to have their own kamon to represent them. Next slide, please. I was able to get the services of Jia Feng, who was a graphic artist and a painter. And some of the, since my grandmother was born in 1895, there weren't many images of her, and she also avoided the camera. So I described her circumstances to Jia, and she was able to create these images for me. She had this love of animals, which I would try to depict here, and she also loved to do physical work. And here she is petting the groundkeeper's Shiba Inu, a Japanese breed of dog, and he's standing by, eager for her to help him in his task. Next slide. This is my great-grandfather. This is Mizuko's father. He had 4 daughters and a son. A son, of course, he was very proud of because the name and the family fortunes passed through the male side of the family at that time. And unfortunately, he was saddled with a tremendous debt while he was married to his first wife. And he ended up honoring that debt, but that actually bankrupted the family. So he was able to keep his fine clothes. I believe these came from China, and was honored by the village that he lived in for his education and his leadership. So he continued to be a leader in that village, even though they were quite poor. This is my grandfather, Kazuichi. He looks kind of scary, and I believe he was. I never met the man. He died in 1930, many years before I was born. But at the time of their marriage, he was twice Mizuko's age of 16. And unbeknownst to her, he was the second, she was his second wife. And she was made aware of that several years later, that she actually had stepdaughters. This is the Mexico Maru, which was the steamship that took Mizuko when she was 16, along with Kazuichi, to the United States, where he already had business and farm interests. And this was, of course, Mizuko's first time away from Japan. And she was, among other Japanese, not too many of them, most of the steerage area where they stayed for 2.5 weeks was occupied by Chinese immigrants who were returning to the United States to work on the railroad and other places. One of the more notable episodes in Mizuko's life was their time in Deer Lodge, Montana. What the heck was she doing in Deer Lodge, you might ask? Well, her husband was a very creative and smart man, but he didn't like to work very hard. And by this time, he had a number of children to support. He heard about free housing up at Deer Lodge in the rail yard. And so he gathered the family together, who was suffering a bit because this is the end of World War I. And in 1918, a lot of the young men that had been in the wars had returned home. So there weren't the kind of jobs on the West Coast that there once were. So they went to Deer Lodge, and the most notable thing about this is because he was such a slacker, Mizuko dressed up as a man and got a job disguised as a man working in the sand house, shoveling sand 10 hours a day. She did this for over a year. Luckily, she was able to escape that and become a cook for the railroad. And she did that for the next 6+ years. This is a depiction of what the rail cars looked like at that time. You can see that they're sitting on rails that are quite askew. Those are temporary rails that are set up so that the rail cars and the sleeping cars and the dining cars could be pushed over onto them while the workers worked on the permanent railway. After the railroad, my grandfather decided that the family needed to be where there were more eligible Japanese men and women to marry. And so they moved to Southern California and ended up in East Long Beach near Terminal Island. At that time, Terminal Island was one of the main West Coast ports for fisheries, and the fish were caught in the nearby Pacific and brought there and processed. And most of the workers in the canneries were women of all nationalities, including Japanese, Eastern Europeans, and many others. She did really hard work most of her life. And after they had a go at a cash and carry grocery store after the canneries. In fact, that was why they went to the canneries, was to earn enough money to create the store and stock it. She did that for a few years. And of course, the Depression came up on them and they basically lost everything. And it basically kept themselves alive for a few years or for a few months, just eating the food off the shelves. By this time, she had 5 children, I should say 6 children, and 2 stepchildren to deal with. So they ended up on her brother-in-law's farm, and she did piecework there, or let's say she got paid a daily rate of $1 a day with all the vegetables that her family could eat. And she did that for a few years during the Depression. You can see here weeding the vegetable patch during that time. We jump forward many years from then. This is when she was 75 years old, and you can see that she's still a vital person. She was incredibly strong. She was tall for her age, for her generation. She was almost 5'6". And I got her to take a picture, one of the few pictures that she would allow herself, holding my son, Chris, who is now going to be 54 in the end of this month. So that's my slide presentation for the current. I have one more to show you later on. Katrina did a really nice job of explaining what the book in general is about. So I thought I would just share a few things about her that weren't in the book, but were incredibly important to me. One of them is my grandmother was unlike most Japanese I knew, including my immediate family, in that she would always greet me with a big hug. And she had this tremendous laugh that she very freely gave out. And I adored her just for those two things. And it happened, I can remember from a very young age being hugged, and I was treated kind of like the little prince because all my siblings at the time were girls. The Mizuko's son-in-laws had girls, and his brother who lived next door also had girls. So there were no boys around. I was the only boy, which was often a negative in my own family. But when I got down to visit my grandmother, it wasn't, and I was treated royally, literally. I have to say also that my grandmother would also live most of her life. She existed in two different worlds, the world of the United States and the world of Japan. And those of you who've been to Japan, you realize that it is very, very different than the United States. There's our interest in the group rather than the individual, which is stressed in America. In addition, conformity was something that was very much cherished and supported, where this individuality and freedom of expression was somewhat frowned upon. So she lived in those two different worlds and did her best to kind of reconcile the two. As I wrote the book, and I worked on it for many, many years, I realized that I had a tremendous responsibility, and because I was trying to recreate history in a way that people would become engaged. And I realized that, historians and people that write about things in a historical sense have tremendous power in their writings. And so I wanted to do things that were quite accurate. And I tried to do the research both within my family and in other sources, many books and articles and doctoral thesis even that I went through. I was lucky enough to get some information from a contact in Japan who was one of my uncle's cousins. Probably the main thing was that my grandmother, Mizuko herself, was very much a storyteller. And every time I was around her, she would tell me a story about something that had happened in her past. In addition, she passed that ability on to her children. My father was a very active storyteller. Sometimes I wondered about the veracity of what he was saying, but I had his 5 siblings to kind of balance the outrageous stories he sometimes told. So I got a pretty good impression of what the family was like, and I was very happy that I had asked the questions. So now I'm going to go into the actual book. I decided that I'm do a short reading for you. Let me just do a little bit of a setup here. Specifically, her life was quite complicated. Not only she was married to a man that oftentimes looked at her and the children that they had together as more of a nuisance than a blessing. And so she was responsible for so many things, keeping them fed and clothed and with a decent place to live. And that was a lot of responsibility on a person who was only 16 when she first came to America. She did a good job with her sons, especially my father and the next oldest son. They were able to start a brokerage business in the wholesale produce market downtown. And they succeeded at that. They had trucks and they had customers and they were doing quite well. Then World War II broke out, and then President Roosevelt made a declaration that is quite infamous at this point in time for those of that are interested in Japanese American history, and basically said you have Japanese Americans and Japanese people on the West Coast, you have a choice. You can either voluntarily go east of the Rocky Mountains and resettle somewhere, or you can be put into relocation camps, which was a very kind of innocuous term for places that were really not very nice. So my father lost his business, he lost his home, as did many, many of his relatives and friends that were Japanese and Japanese American. And they were loaded onto buses and taken to what we called at that time camp. But it's since been recognized as a concentration camp rather than a day camp, which I thought of when I first heard of it when I was a child. So let me read an excerpt from chapter 17. The title of that chapter is Before the Storm. And I'm going to start up about 2/3 of the way through that chapter. There's a lot of evocative things that happen, but hopefully I've captured some of the feelings that they experienced during this time. On the cloudy morning of May 2nd, 1942, a detachment of armed soldiers stood guard over a line of red trailway buses idling at the curb. The Nomuras dutifully boarded the lead bus, and with just their personal belongings that they could carry, the two married couples, Yoshiko and Sam Hasegawa, and Henry and Mikako Nomura. My father was going by the name Henry rather than Takuma at this time. Joined Mizuko and the rest of the family as they boarded. Sam's older sister Sakiko and their father Kinzaburo Hasegawa also climbed aboard. As the bus neared capacity, the line of evacuees was halted momentarily, and two military policemen in combat uniforms, armed with rifles, affixed with bayonets, got on. The windows of the bus were blocked with black curtains, so no one could see inside or out. The anxious passengers were each handed a box lunch, and the bus lurched away. Although no one knew exactly where their first destination was located, they were afraid to even ask questions of their stern-faced armed escorts. What few discussions did occur among the passengers were hushed and brief. The presence of the soldiers kept everyone fearfully on edge. I'm going to skip ahead a few paragraphs. Across the narrow aisle, Henry sat uncharacteristically silent with his new bride, Mikako. Feeling his mother's gaze, Henry pursed his lips and shook his head slowly. Behind them, Yoshiko, 4 months pregnant, seemed on the verge of succumbing to the morning sickness that had plagued her pregnancy from the start. Her rugged husband, Sam, usually full of smiles, stared stoically ahead. Ayako, settled next to her mother, seemed unable to tear her eyes away from the armed soldiers stationed at the front of the bus. Mizuko reached over and touched her daughter's folded hands until Ayako broke her stare to look at her mother. Her expression of dismay and confusion nearly broke Mizuko's heart. Turning to look toward the back of the bus, Mizuko could see Carl and Jimmy sitting together. Carl's expression was guarded, but Mizuko knew that of all their children, he was probably feeling the injustice of the situation the most. He turned and glanced her way and nodded, as if he understood the necessity of maintaining his composure. 12-year-old Jimmy, on the other hand, her youngest, was the only one of her children with a smile on his face. To him, the evacuation was a great adventure. She could see him craning his neck as he tried to see through the distant front windshield. She scanned the bus for her second son, Jiro, until she remembered he had left 2 months earlier to help build the Manzanar facility. Shigatagana, thought Mizuko. We will make the best of whatever happens. With gaman, we will endure. After another hour of jostling travel, the bus turned off the main highway and proceeded slowly over a rutted road. Finally, the bus squeezed to a stop. As soon as the door opened, the MPs exited the bus with their rifles held upright in a present arms position and stationed themselves officiously at each side of the doorway. Climbing slowly down the steps of the bus, the Nomura's anxious demeanor lightened momentarily as young Jimmy called out to a waiting Jiro. Then, for a long moment, the sheer desolation of their new surroundings robbed everyone of speech. Seemingly within reach through the crystalline air, the snow-covered peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountain range loomed to the west. Immediately before them, stretching into the distance, were identical wooden barracks aligned in rows like the graves of the Veterans Cemetery in West Los Angeles. Each building was identical to the other, the only distinguishing feature being a plaque with a barracks number. Surrounding the perimeter of the camp were multiple guard towers adjacent to a perimeter of barbed wire. In each of the nearest towers, a soldier stood, aiming a weapon down at the new arrivals. Skipping forward, as they milled around before leaving the assembly area, the dusty ground rose in powdery puffs around everyone's feet. To Mizuko, the 4-inch thick layer of dust was so fine that it reminded her of baking flour. As they began walking to their assigned quarters, lugging their belongings, the gentle breeze that had greeted their arrival abruptly turned into a powerful swirling wind. The floury dust went airborne and transformed into billowing clouds of grit that obscured everything. Everyone instinctively grabbed for jackets, sweaters, or whatever else was on hand to cover noses and shield eyes from the noxious powder. Luckily, Jiro had memorized the location of Block 15, Barracks 6, and led the way forward. Nearly concealed by the blinding wind, he led them forward by calling out, "This way, this way." After what seemed like an endless shuffling forward, they literally walked into the front wall of a rudimentary wooden building. Using the rough-hewn surface as a guide, they groped their way to the barracks doorway. The roar of the windstorm diminished as Jiro pulled the flimsy wood slat door shut behind him. The assembled family stared silently at their accommodations in the late afternoon gloom. Puffs of dust, driven by the wind outside, rose up through the cracks and knotholes in the rough flooring, illuminated solely by the hazy sunlight passing through the bare windows. A sparsely furnished room stood before them. Stacked against the far wall were the straw-filled mattresses that Jiro had brought in for their use. As they slapped the dust from their clothing and belongings, Ayako was suddenly consumed with a fit of violent coughing and sneezing. Jiro and Mizuko patted and rubbed her back until she was finally able to breathe normally. "Let's get busy," said Mizuko with steely conviction. Following her lead, the Nomuras turned to the task at hand. Like it or not, Manzanar was their new home. So that's the end of chapter 17. So Katrina.
Yes, thank you so much for that powerful, selecting that powerful selection. That's sort of redundant to read out. As you mentioned before your reading, it is incredibly evocative. I believe you captured so perfectly and in such crystal clarity the sounds, the smells, the sights, the feelings of what it was like to arrive at Manzanar. Um, as we mentioned in your biography at the beginning of the program, you were born in the camp. Um, and I know that it is such a painful experience, the internment experience for Japanese Americans. What was it like in your family unpacking this history? Was it openly spoken about or not? Or how did discussions around that topic center in your home, in your family?
Well, it's basically not something that was talked about. I think there was a certain layer of embarrassment and, because they were basically powerless. Here they were American citizens, but they were offered no due process and they were basically treated like criminals. And so it was an embarrassing thing for them to have experienced. It wasn't until many, many years later that I got a glimpse of what they had gone through. And I can tell you a little story there. I once worked for this company, a nonprofit, which still exists, called Visual Communications. And we were documenting the redress reparation committee that was coming through at the time in the early 80s. And we had a video camera and a recorder. We said, we should record this. And so I went over there and I had training as a photographer already and I knew how to shoot. And so I was documenting the meeting and then I decided to turn around and shoot individual shots of the audience members. And the room was quite full of Japanese Americans. And I zoomed in on one person and it was my mother. And it was so shocking for me to see. I almost let the camera go, but I realized that she had a keen interest on what was being discussed. And that was the first idea that I had, that maybe she was willing to talk about what had transpired. Yeah.
And how did you kind of pull that thread? Because your book is a mixture of research, like hard research that you have dates, you have times, you have photographs in the book, but you also it's family storytelling as well. And I was just wondering, how did you first start to spool this thread of telling your grandmother's story?
Well, the storytelling, it wasn't a problem to get because, as I said, my grandmother and her children were all sort of natural storytellers. And so when we got together, there was always some stories being told about the past. And, a number of them were repeated over time. So I got so that I could question them pretty precisely, say, well, last time you said this, well, what about that? And so that went on throughout my childhood and on into my adulthood. I realized very late, too late, after my grandmother had passed, I was already a professional filmmaker, and I thought, gosh, I missed an opportunity here. I should have interviewed him. And that's one thing I want to stress to your audience at the end of this talk.
Yes, I think that's something, especially in Asian American communities, I believe that we don't do enough of. It's first, there's the reticence of some folks to talk about, which is completely understandable, some multi-generational trauma that exists, but also we don't ask the questions and take the time to record our family histories. And as you mentioned, it is so important because once that person has passed on, you lose their voice, right? Directly from the source. So thank you for bringing that up. But yes, I wanted to ask you, I'm a librarian, so I need to know, how was your research process? How did you begin? Because it is an epic story. You're telling an epic story of this amazing woman's life. How did you go about with your research? Because I'm assuming you're not a professional researcher. How did you go about starting on your research for your book?
Well, as a filmmaker and a video maker, I had made a number of documentary films over the years. So I was used to doing a certain level of research. And in addition, one of my uncles, Carl, who was mentioned in the reading, he was the second youngest son, was a very learned man. He ended up getting up a PhD in physics and at the University of Minnesota. And he wrote a book called Sleeping on Potatoes. And to me, it's a really good book because it has a lot of interesting information. But he was a scientist and an engineer type, and I didn't think it was very evocative in a certain way. But I use it as a kind of a jumping off point, and he introduced me to some people like his cousin in Japan, who was able to fill in a lot of the Japanese information. So I started there, and then I ended up interviewing a lot of my other aunts and uncles who had their own take on things as well. So that's how it began. And then when that kind of level of information had already been exhausted, then I went into a lot of books about immigrants in general and Japanese Americans in particular, and that helped as well.
Oh, right. And what was it specifically about your grandmother's story that really captured your imagination? Was it because she was such a heralded figure in your family and you were hearing all these stories about her? What was the inspiration to tell her story?
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting because, I am a Sansei Japanese American, and a lot of my contemporaries, I'm older than a lot of my contemporaries, but still, they often would make films, documentaries about their grandparents. And some of them had experienced the camps, some of them were a little bit younger, but and they were really well done documentaries. And I thought, I saw maybe 3 or 4 of them, maybe more. And every time I walked away from a screening, I didn't say this to the filmmakers, but I thought to myself, God, they were pretty boring because I knew my grandmother, right? And I thought, geez, that's really a nicely told story, but basically that's a sweet old person that has done the predictable things in my way of thinking. And my grandmother was certainly not predictable. Yeah.
I think you really captured her spirit so wonderfully. And again, if you folks haven't had a chance to read it yet, we do have it in the library system. You can place a hold. We also have ebook copies. If Kasha would be kind enough to share the link to that, you can also get more information on the book through Art's website. But yes, I wanted to ask you about your writing process. So is this your first stab at writing in terms of like writing a novel?
Yes, it was challenging.
And you mentioned your family is natural storytellers. I think you're continuing in that line, Art, because the writing is so fantastic. And as you mentioned, I think the word that fits it so perfectly is evocative. Can you speak about the challenges? You mentioned that it was difficult. What were some of the challenges for a first-time novelist such as yourself?
Well, one of the challenges was filling in details about her early life because she was so old and so much time had passed after she died that there weren't any people that were alive when she was a child. And so I had to go back into historical novels and other references and look at what life was like back in those days. And there were a few family photographs that I could kind of extrapolate from, but just knowing my grandmother, I actually had to be a bit creative, which I enjoyed, but it was challenging at the same time. And I know that, for instance, she was a very intelligent person, and she was like always at the top of her class in terms of her studies. In fact, at one time when she was a teenager, her father said that she could go on to study to be a medical doctor, which was pretty much unheard of for women at that time. But of course, that dream went away once their financial situation changed. So I did make up things, but based on historical information, and there were many stories. And the challenge with the many stories, of course, was that a story cannot be a chapter. And so Sometimes I would take an incident that they told me and I would expand on that. And I said, well, it's a logical thing that could happen here. And between all these different sources, I was able to piece together a story of sorts. And then I had to think about the whole of this life that she was living and connect them all. So it was a good challenge. It was frustrating. It took a long time.
Mm.
Um,
How long are we talking? How long from inception to completion?
yeah, that's a hard question because, I probably started the whole process. I'm saying it took the better part of 10 years. And
Mm,
it's not because I wasn't working on it full time all the time because I had a full-time job,
mhm,
family to raise and so forth. So, um, I would get back to it and work feverishly on it for a week or two, and then it would sit for a while. And then I also did interviews because I have video skills.
mhm,
And sometimes the people I wanted to interview, they would tell me a story, but they wouldn't get to what I thought was the meat of the issue. And
mm,
so I actually went to a number of them and shot video of them and asked the questions I was wondering about. And they
mm.
said, oh, yeah, this happened. And so I was able to get information that were beyond just the stories that I had heard so many times. Yeah.
Mm. And I was poking around on your website and on the section about your book, it did mention that this is a revised iteration. You had this book in a different form, or could you fill in the blanks on that?
Well, my initial effort, I actually did something for iPad, and they had something called iBook. It was an app that Apple
Mm,
came out. It was a fantastic app which allowed you to combine not only text but also images and video. Really, you could put video into the book.
mm,
And so I did a version of that, and that took a long, long time
mm,
because I was learning the technology and experimenting. And I made an attempt to market it. Marketing has never been my strong suit, but I knew tech. And so, but everyone I showed it to, they says, wow, well, that's really great. We've never seen anything like it. And that was pretty much the end of the discussion. So, and then kind of the last, the kind of the death knell was, I guess, last year, um, Apple decided to discontinue the iBook app.
mm,
And so now I have an iPad that you can
mm,
watch the thing on, but it's not really transferable.
mm,
The other issue was I have an older sister that's mentioned in the book, Hatsume Catherine, and she's been very influential in my life because she's a really good writer on her own in her own way, and she went from a bossy older sister to probably one of my best friends. So
mm,
that's really a nice thing. And we worked on it, and she said, well, that iBook, that idea you came up with is really great, but the problem is none of my friends have iBooks,
mhm,
nor do they have Mac computers, so they can't read what you wrote.
mm,
So you have to make a book. And I resisted for a while, and I said, okay, well, that's probably a good idea. And then I said, okay, it'd be a simple thing to just translate it into a book. However, the simple thing took me a couple of years to do. And it resulted in Mizuko True Spirit. So yes, there are other iterations, but this is quite different from the original one.
mm.
Yeah.
It sounds fascinating that I'm not familiar, unfortunately, that you could add video. And it sounds like when the New York Times has similar, they have the narrative story, and then they were adding like different things to make it feel more interactive, like video and like photographs that you could enlarge stuff. So that sounds very fascinating. I wonder why they did away with it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay, this is one of the problems of being a creative person,
Mm,
which I consider myself to be creative. So sometimes you think of an idea And the rest of the world is not quite there yet. And so then you would execute the idea, and then 10 years later, something comes up that's more in the mass consumption world, and then it does well. So I won't say it's a curse, but it's just the way that I think about things sometimes. And I feel like the book itself is a bit retro in that it's an old medium, but it's still an effective medium. So
it has endured through centuries. So
that's right.
yeah.
That's right. Yes.
And I think, Art, you're being very modest when you say you're a creative person, because please visit his website. You are a jack of many trades. There's so many mediums that you work with, film, video, sculptures, and now novels. I was wondering, are you working on anything writing wise? Is there anything that you're cooking up in terms of your writing?
Yes, I am doing some other work. I realized that one of the great things about writing is that you can do it pretty much as a one-man band. And it's not true with doing media. If you're doing a film, there are a lot of other people that need to be involved. And so even though a lot of my productions were fairly modest, I still had to have other people working with me, and then, which is fun. It's also very challenging because, of course, they don't always do exactly what you want them to do, and things have to be explained and argued about and so on and so forth. So I thought, okay, if I get into this writing mode, then yeah, I can just be on my own until it comes the time to actually publish it, and then I'm involved with other people again, editors and so forth. But so I am working on 3 different projects.
3, wow.
2 of them are nonfiction. And the third is a very elaborate fiction novel, a thriller. And I don't want to let too much out of the bag because, of course, they're going to change a lot. But I'll give you the title of the nonfiction ones. One is called Last One Out of the Genkan. It's derived. When I went to Japan, I was in my mid-50s already, and I was working on a documentary of my own at that time. And I realized that whenever I went into the Genkan is that little ante-room before the main dwelling, and it's a place where you take off your shoes before you go inside, all right, or your jacket or whatever. And I was always the last one to finish taking off their shoes and go inside. And conversely, when it came time to go outside, I was always the last one to put on my shoes. So I was always the last one out of the Genkan. So it's about that, of course, but it's also more of a metaphor for this idea of, if you think about things a lot, sometimes it's difficult to take action because you're thinking, is this the right thing? Is that the right thing? Many people around you think, well, just go. I mean, not even consider that. But I've always been one to consider things a lot. So that's what that book's about. And the other book is called Being Art. And that has to do, it's a play on my name. My full name is Arthur, but I've gone by Art for the last 50 years. And it's by choice because I realized that I've always felt a strong attraction to being creative and to being an artist. And so it's a series of stories about those kinds of trials and tribulations, especially in the world of USA, where things are pretty much added up as how much money did you make, what thing did you accomplish, what kind of business deal did you do. I'm not interested in that stuff. I like to create things. I like to make things. And so I'm going to talk about that because I was into that from a very, very young age, even before I could probably talk. I was really interested in doing things. So I've tried to continue that until today. So that's the two nonfiction. And the fictional one is a complete departure. I read a lot. The stuff that I do read is mostly fiction. I don't read nonfiction. And I've come to really be enthralled with some of the writers that I've come across, and especially those that have a journalistic background.
Mhm.
They seem to be able to be very succinct in ways that I am not.
Mhm.
And I admire that. So I've been trying to write a book along those lines.
Well, I know that I'm actually looking forward to more of your work, and hopefully we can have you back so you can talk about those works. But I'm going to open it up to, we're heading towards the end of the program, so I'm going to open it up to some audience questions. So this is the last call for questions, folks. If you have anything to ask Art, please go ahead and do that in the Q&A. So first question is from Diana. She says, Art, today neighbors rally around each other for support in tough and terrible times. Did your grandmother see any support and light of the times she went through?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think prior to their time in Manzanar, she did not. I mean, it was really a tough kind of situation. Racism was an issue for anyone that wasn't in the majority. And of course, she felt that. She was not a citizen, so she felt it that way. For many people, Manzanar was a terrible, terrible diversion or problem in their lives. But for the Issei, that is the first generation of Japanese Americans, it was kind of a holiday, because they didn't have to worry about making money just to eat and find a place to stay and so forth. It was all being provided. And so even though they got a very small stipend, I think, what was it, $10 a month or something ridiculously small, they were happier because they didn't have the stress of trying to exist. And because they didn't have that stress, they were able to interact with people their own age who were experiencing the same thing. So they actually had a social circle that you could interact with. And so, yes, I think she did. And then also during the camps, she decided that she wanted to convert to Catholicism, because her eldest daughter had lost her first child right after childbirth, because mostly because of the inadequacies of the Manzanar hospital. And then her second child, who is a wonderful person, she died. She was born with a defect in her heart, and she died at a young age. So anyway, what kept her going, it was she had a belief in God, and she was a devout Catholic. That's a whole nother story I won't go into, but my grandmother was so impressed by her, she decided that she would become Catholic as well. And that's what she ended up doing for the next 30 or 40 years until she passed away.
So she felt a real sense of community with the.
Yes, there was a community that accepted her, that shared the same faith, and I think it was very sustaining.
Thank you for answering that question. We have another one from Hamza in the audience. Were there any other characters/figures in your family that you felt could have deserved their own novel, their own appreciation?
Well, I've already mentioned the fact that my father, Henry Takuma, was quite a character. And, he would do ridiculous things. I mean, one of his claims to fame among my children, who are now in their 50s, was that when we go out to eat, he would make the sounds of animals. He was not that good at it, but he was very loud. And he did it mostly for their enjoyment. He didn't seem to have any kind of governors on what he would do. He didn't get embarrassed by it. He would just do it. And another example is that he later on he became a pretty prosperous businessman despite the camps. And he would say to me, he was very impulsive. He'd say, Ikuo, which is my Japanese name. Come on, let's go. We're gonna go buy a car.
Mhm.
I said, well, then you want to ask mom? She goes, no, let's just get a car. So then we would go to the car dealership, and he would be wearing his work pants, old khakis, and a t-shirt
Mhm.
and boots. And he says, well, you just watch this. And he would just go up there and he would lay on his accent pretty heavy and so on and so forth. And it took a long time for salesmen to even acknowledge him. Then they would start bartering with him and so on, and are bargaining with him. And then he said, well, that's okay, but that's not good enough. So he'd walk away. And pretty soon they would just, be really uh, straining to get his attention. So
Mhm.
he loved to perform in that sense,
Mhm.
right? And I think that came from his father, who was also a performer. So he
Mhm.
might actually have been a good subject for a book.
Mhm.
I don't know if I wanted to spend that much time with him though,
Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
get that book. I mean,
Mhm.
he was a good man, but he can be a bit much.
Mm. I think we all can relate. There's a few folks in every family, I think, that are a bit much. We have a few more questions. Do you have advice for the younger generation who are trying to start their own family history projects? And the second part to that question is, especially families who went through traumas such as war and or genocide.
Oh boy, that's a hard one, because even opening up that discussion is can be very, very difficult.
Mhm.
But I think that if you can get a person in private and talk to them one-on-one, I think that's key. Sometimes older people, if they're among their peers or other people, they feel added pressure.
Mhm.
And so that's not a good situation to be under.
Right.
Um, there are outside resources like there's ancestry.com, of course, that most people know about, but the Mormon Church actually has a huge repository of information about one's background, and so they're quite open to having outsiders, people that are not Mormon, come in and do the research there. So um, I would do that as well, and
Mhm.
just start talking to your elders and see if you can open a dialogue. There might be some resistance at first, but I think if you persist, I think it'll get better.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Art, for your time and for sharing your grandmother's, Mizuko's amazing life with us. And I feel like I know this woman myself. She's such a towering figure in your family's life, and now for every reader, she is as well. I know you wanted to end on a photo that I'll share now.
Okay. Yes, this photo is historical for many reasons. That's me on the far right. I was about 5 years old. That's my sister, Hatsumi Catherine, um, next to me. And next to her is Hiromi Alice. And the three of us were all born in Manzanar. The other two are Hiromi's sister Anne and my younger sister Noreen, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. Um, there's some very dramatic episodes around both Hatsumi and Hiromi. And I won't go into the details, but they're in the book. Hiromi was especially pivotal to my grandmother because she lived with my grandmother down in Chula Vista and San Isidro in Southern California. And she was very precocious and very smart, and she actually was bilingual. So she helped my grandmother get her citizenship when that became available in the mid-50s. Unfortunately, she passed away when she was 14. She had open heart surgery and she didn't survive. And that was my first experience of losing somebody close to me. It was really devastating. So I thought I'd share that photo with you. I think it's a really nice photo and has so much history behind it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Art. Thank you so much again for your time and sharing your family's story with us. Again, if you'd like to go ahead and place a hold or download a copy of Mizuko, I'm sorry, I'm tongue-tied. Mizuku True Spirits by Art Nomura. Please do so. Kasha has kindly shared the link in the chat. It's a wonderful book. Please read it. It really is such a narrative story. It's propulsive, the storytelling. I raced through it, and I think you will enjoy it as well. And thank you for being such a wonderful audience, Kasha. Thank you for being a wonderful moderator, and of course, once again, thank you so much to Art Nomura. This has been wonderful, and it has been an honor speaking with you. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and I want to wish everyone a wonderful rest of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Please do visit our Heritage Month page so you can celebrate this wonderful time of year in our libraries and also learn a little bit more about the AANHPI community. And yes, thank you again. Have a wonderful evening. Take care, and we'll see you again next time. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much, Art. Thank you, Kasha.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.